The night someone tells you where you belong is often the same night you discover where your heart will never stay. If this story finds you after a long day, or in one of those quiet hours when the world finally slows down, I'd love to know where you're listening from, what time it is where you are, or simply what brought you here tonight, because stories seem to find us when we need them most. The Atlantic wind swept across the rocky shoreline of Camden, Maine, carrying the scent of salt and pine through the towering windows of the Billionaire estate. The house stood on the cliffs like an aging lighthouse that had forgotten how to welcome ships home. Its polished oak floors reflected the warm glow of antique chandeliers, yet somehow every room felt colder than the winter ocean outside. Nerissa Bellwether paused just inside the front entrance, her wedding band still unfamiliar against her finger. Only 2 hours earlier, she had signed a marriage certificate inside a quiet county courthouse. There had been no orchestra, no flower petals, no cheering guests. Just 2 signatures, 2 witnesses, and a contract that looked far more permanent than either of them was willing to admit. She carefully removed her wool coat and folded it across one arm, taking in the portraits lining the hallway. Generations of the Billionaire family stared back from gilded frames with expressions polished by wealth and expectation. Somewhere deeper inside the estate, an antique grandfather clock marked another passing minute. Then came the measured sound of polished leather shoes crossing marble. Lachlan Billionaire appeared from the library without haste, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked untouched by the rain outside. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet discipline of a man who had spent years believing that emotions only complicated important decisions. His gray eyes rested on Nerissa for only a heartbeat before moving toward the walnut console table near the staircase. Without a single unnecessary word, he placed a small brass key onto the polished wood. The metal struck the surface with a soft click that echoed far louder than it should have. "You'll sleep in the guest room," he said evenly. No apology, no hesitation, just a sentence delivered with the same precision he probably used during board meetings worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The silence that followed settled between them like fresh snow. Nerissa looked at the key before lifting her eyes to meet his. Her expression never cracked. She neither argued nor searched his face for kindness that wasn't there. Instead, she reached forward, wrapped her fingers around the cool brass key, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. "Then remember," she answered quietly, her voice steady enough to make even the old clock seem louder. "You were the one who decided your wife should feel like a guest." Lachlan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he offered no reply. He simply turned toward the wide staircase leading to the second floor, carrying with him the distance that had already become part of their marriage. Nerissa remained where she was for another moment, listening to the ocean crash against the cliffs below the estate. The sound reminded her that even the strongest stone was shaped by tides that refused to hurry. She followed the housekeeper down a quiet hallway until they stopped before a simple guest bedroom overlooking the gray Atlantic. It was elegant, immaculate, and painfully temporary. As the door closed behind her, she rested her suitcase beside the bed and slowly removed the wedding ring, only long enough to study its reflection beneath the bedside lamp before slipping it back onto her finger. Some promises were made with love, others were made with necessity. Tonight, she had entered a marriage built on signatures instead of trust. Neither of them knew that before 18 months had passed, that little brass key would become the most valuable thing either of them had ever held. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of weathered steel, and the Atlantic rolled against the cliffs with the steady confidence of something that had survived every storm before it. Nerissa woke before sunrise, not because she had rested, but because unfamiliar houses always carried unfamiliar silence. She opened the curtains of the guest room, allowing pale morning light to spill across hardwood floors polished so perfectly that they reflected the sea beyond the windows. The room was beautiful, comfortable, thoughtfully furnished. Yet every carefully chosen detail reminded her that someone had prepared this space for visitors, never imagining it would become a wife's first home. Downstairs, the aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the long hallway. A housekeeper greeted her with a warm smile before quietly placing breakfast on the dining table set for 2. Lachlan was already seated at the opposite end, reading financial reports displayed across a slim tablet, while a leather folder rested beside his coffee cup. He acknowledged her arrival with a courteous nod rather than conversation. The distance between their chairs measured barely 16 feet, yet it felt greater than the miles separating Maine from California. Nerissa poured herself coffee before taking the seat across from him. Neither reached for the elegant breakfast immediately. Instead, the silence settled once again, familiar already despite being less than a day old. Finally, Lachlan closed the folder and slid it toward her across the polished walnut table. "There is one document we did not review yesterday," he said calmly. Nerissa opened the folder without haste. Inside rested an amended agreement prepared by Thayer Kessick, the attorney who had orchestrated their unusual arrangement. Every clause was typed with flawless precision. 18 months of legal marriage. Public appearances together when required by the board of Billionaire Maritime. Separate financial independence. Separate bedrooms. Absolute confidentiality regarding the agreement. Upon completion, both parties would dissolve the marriage without contest. She continued reading until her attention settled on the final page. In exchange for her participation, the Billionaire Family Trust would provide complete funding to preserve the Bellwether Historical Library, the century-old building where her late father had spent decades teaching architecture students to appreciate craftsmanship instead of convenience. She gently closed the folder. "So this is what my signature purchased," she said softly. Lachlan shook his head once. "No, it protects something you love. That is different." Nerissa studied him carefully. His words sounded sincere, yet they arrived wrapped inside the careful language of contracts and obligations. "Buildings can be restored," she replied after a quiet pause. "Trust does not come with renovation plans." A flicker crossed his expression before disappearing beneath practiced composure. He folded his hands together. "I am not asking for trust." "I know," she answered. "That is exactly what concerns me." Outside, gulls circled above the crashing waves as sunlight slowly reached the estate's stone walls. The old house had stood for generations because every foundation stone supported the next. Nerissa wondered if marriages worked the same way. She had agreed to save a library built by strangers long before she was born. She simply had not realized she would also be asked to live inside a house where every promise came with numbered clauses and every kindness required a signature. The first week inside the Billionaire estate unfolded with the quiet precision of a clock that had forgotten how to lose a second. Every morning, Lachlan left for the headquarters of Billionaire Maritime before 7 o'clock, his schedule measured down to the minute, while Nerissa drove 30 miles south to the Bellwether Historical Library, where decades of salt air and neglected repairs had slowly stolen the strength from the old brick building. By late afternoon, she returned carrying rolled blueprints beneath one arm and the faint scent of cedar dust on her coat, while he returned with board reports, investor calls, and another layer of silence settled across his shoulders. They shared the same address, the same dining room, and the same last name on paper, yet their lives moved beside each other like parallel tracks that never met. One evening, Nerissa noticed that heavy velvet curtains remained closed throughout the west wing, shutting out the spectacular ocean view. She quietly pulled them open one by one, allowing the orange glow of sunset to pour across the marble floor. The housekeeper stopped for a moment and smiled as though she had not seen that much natural light inside the estate in years. The following morning, fresh flowers appeared on the entrance table. Nobody admitted placing them there. Later that afternoon, Nerissa wandered into an unused sitting room where antique furniture sat beneath white linen covers. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight as she removed one cloth after another, revealing hand-carved walnut chairs and an upright piano that had not been touched in years. She called the maintenance supervisor and asked if the room could be cleaned rather than remodeled. "Everything does not need replacing," she said gently. "Sometimes it only needs someone willing to remember why it mattered." When Lachlan returned that evening, he stopped at the doorway. His eyes traveled slowly across the restored room before settling on the uncovered piano. "I asked that this room remain closed," he said evenly. Nerissa looked up from polishing the carved edge of a small table. "No one told me. Now you know." She set the cloth aside without raising her voice. It seemed like a shame to let an entire room disappear behind sheets forever. His expression remained controlled, yet something unreadable flickered beneath the surface. Some memories are easier to manage when they stay covered. Nerissa considered his words before answering. Covered is not the same as healed. Neither spoke again for several seconds. Outside, waves struck the rocks below the cliffs with patient determination, as though the ocean itself understood that even stones surrendered only after countless quiet moments. At dinner, the conversation was brief. He asked whether the library restoration had enough funding to begin roof repairs. She answered that the engineers would inspect the foundation the following week. It was the longest exchange they had shared since the wedding. Before leaving the table, Lachlan paused beside the doorway. Without looking directly at her, he spoke almost absent-mindedly. The flowers looked better in the sunlight. Then he continued upstairs. Nerissa watched him disappear beyond the landing and realized that beneath every carefully measured sentence lived a man who noticed far more than he allowed anyone to see. The walls surrounding him had not been built overnight. They had been constructed one silent brick at a time, and for the first time she wondered whether someone had once closed those curtains for exactly the same reason. 3 weeks passed, and the rhythm of the house slowly changed in ways neither of them acknowledged aloud. Every evening the western windows remained open, allowing the scent of the Atlantic to drift through the halls. The dining table no longer felt like a boardroom where silence conducted every conversation. Sometimes Lachlan asked a question about the library restoration. Sometimes Nerissa answered with more than a single sentence. It was never enough to resemble ordinary marriage, but it was enough to soften the sharp edges that had greeted them on the first night. Then the weather shifted. The local forecast warned that a powerful coastal storm was moving toward mid-coast Maine, bringing heavy rain and wind strong enough to rattle windows that had stood for generations. By late afternoon, dark clouds swallowed the horizon, and the sea below the estate turned from silver to deep slate. Staff members secured outdoor furniture, while maintenance crews checked emergency generators. Shortly after sunset, the lights flickered once, then again, before the entire estate fell into darkness. Only the distant beam from a lighthouse cut through the rain, sweeping slowly across the cliffs like a silent guardian. Nerissa lit a battery lantern and stepped into the hallway. The house felt different without electricity, less like a monument to wealth, more like an old home remembering its age. As she walked toward the main staircase, one of the groundskeepers rushed inside through the service entrance, soaked from the rain and struggling to catch his breath. He explained that a section of the detached garden workshop had begun taking on water. Inside were several crates containing carved wood panels removed from the Bellwether Library for restoration. They could not remain there overnight. Before anyone else spoke, Nerissa reached for a waterproof jacket hanging near the door. "I will help move them," she said. Lachlan immediately looked up from the flashlight he had been checking. "The weather is getting worse. If those panels absorb too much water, a century of craftsmanship could be lost. The crew can handle it." She met his eyes calmly. "Those carvings are fragile. They need someone who knows how to move them." Another crack of thunder rolled across the coastline. For one brief moment, neither of them moved. Then Lachlan reached for his own raincoat without another word. They crossed the courtyard together through wind-driven rain that blurred the stone pathway beneath their feet. Inside the workshop, lantern light danced across stacks of cedar crates. Nerissa carefully inspected each one before directing the workers where to lift and where to support the aging wood. Her voice remained steady despite the storm outside. She treated every carved panel as though she were protecting a chapter of someone's family history. Lachlan watched quietly as she knelt beside one damaged crate, gently covering an exposed corner with canvas before asking the crew to carry it first. She never hurried. She never complained. She simply placed preservation above comfort without expecting recognition. Nearly an hour later, they returned to the estate, clothes damp from the rain and shoes marked with traces of wet earth. As Nerissa removed her gloves in the entrance hall, she noticed Lachlan standing unusually still. His gaze rested not on the rescued crates now safely stored inside the house, but on her. "You could have stayed inside," he said softly. She offered the faintest smile. "So could you." For the first time since their unusual marriage had begun, he did not have an answer prepared. Instead, He quietly accepted the towel the housekeeper handed him before extending another toward Nerissa without thinking. It was a small gesture, almost invisible. Yet somewhere beneath the sound of rain against the windows, the first crack appeared in the walls he had spent years building around his heart. The morning after the storm, the Atlantic seemed almost apologetic. Gentle waves rolled toward the rocky shoreline, and sunlight scattered across the water like thousands of tiny pieces of glass. The estate breathed differently as windows stood open to the fresh sea air, carrying away the heaviness that had settled over the house for years. Nerissa left early for the Bellwether Historical Library, expecting another day of structural inspections and engineering reports. Instead, she found a black sport utility vehicle already parked outside the weathered brick building. Lachlan stood beside the entrance in a navy overcoat, speaking with the chief structural engineer while reviewing a stack of architectural drawings. He looked completely out of place among old limestone walls and worn timber beams. Yet somehow he listened with the patience of someone trying to understand a language he had never spoken before. When she approached, he handed her a pair of protective work gloves. "The engineer believes the Western Foundation can be preserved instead of replaced," he said. Nerissa looked at him with quiet surprise. "That will cost more." "Yes," he answered simply. "But replacing history is usually more expensive." Those words stayed with her long after the meeting ended. During the following weeks, their schedules slowly began overlapping without either of them planning it. Sometimes Lachlan stopped by the library after board meetings, bringing coffee without asking how she preferred it, because he had already noticed she always chose dark roast with no sugar. Sometimes Nerissa returned to the estate carrying fresh sketches and found that someone had repaired the reading lamp beside her favorite chair in the guest room before she ever mentioned it was broken. Neither thanked the other directly. Gratitude existed quietly between actions instead of conversations. One Friday morning, Lachlan invited her to accompany him to Bath, Maine, where Vayner Maritime owned one of the oldest shipyards on the East Coast. Investors wanted to demolish an abandoned lighthouse overlooking the harbor to make room for expanded shipping operations. As executives debated projected revenue and construction costs, Nerissa walked silently toward the weathered tower standing against the blue horizon. She rested one hand on its faded stone wall before speaking. "If you remove this lighthouse, you gain another loading dock. If you preserve it, you give this town a reason to remember who built it." Several board members exchanged doubtful glances. One executive quietly calculated maintenance expenses beneath his breath. Lachlan remained silent for nearly a full minute while gulls circled above the harbor. Finally, he closed the financial presentation resting in front of him. "The lighthouse stays," he announced. "Convert it into a maritime training center for local apprentices. We will absorb the additional cost." The room fell completely still. Sabine Hollister, a senior member of the board, stared at him with open disbelief. "That decision reduces projected earnings." Lachlan met her gaze without raising his voice. "Not everything valuable appears on quarterly reports." As they drove back along the Maine coastline that evening, golden sunlight stretched across the highway. Neither spoke much. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. When they returned to the estate, Nerissa climbed the staircase toward the guest room as she had every night since arriving. Just as she reached the door, she heard footsteps behind her. Lachlan stood at the opposite end of the hallway, one hand resting lightly against the frame of the master bedroom. His expression carried none of the certainty that usually accompanied every decision he made. "You do not have to stay in there forever," he said quietly. Nerissa looked toward the brass key still resting inside her hand before lifting her eyes to his. Her answer arrived without bitterness, only honesty. "You have never invited me anywhere else." He remained standing there long after she closed the guest room door. For the first time in many years, the distance between two rooms inside the Vayner estate felt far greater than the distance between two hearts slowly learning how to cross it. October settled over coastal Maine with crisp mornings, crimson maples, and air that carried the unmistakable promise of change. At the Bellwether Historical Library, restoration crews carefully removed damaged brick one piece at a time while fresh cedar beams waited beneath protective canvas. Nerissa spent her days moving between architects, preservation specialists, and local craftsmen, watching a forgotten landmark slowly reclaim its dignity. Every afternoon, almost without fail, a black sedan appeared outside the library shortly before sunset. Sometimes Lachlan stayed only 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. He rarely interrupted her work. Instead, he stood quietly beside scaffolding, asking thoughtful questions about century-old masonry or hand-carved moldings that he once would have dismissed as decorative expenses. It became a routine neither of them acknowledged. One afternoon, she noticed him tracing the grain of a restored oak banister with unusual concentration. "You are looking at it as if it reminds you of something," she said. He remained silent for a moment before answering. "My grandfather believed people revealed themselves by what they chose to preserve." Nerissa smiled gently. Perhaps he was right. He almost smiled back. Almost. Yet while something warm slowly grew between them, another pair of eyes had begun observing every quiet change. Sabine Hollister had spent 20 years helping build Vayner Maritime into one of the largest shipping companies on the East Coast, but she believed sentiment weakened leadership. Lachlan's recent decisions troubled her. The restored lighthouse, increased preservation funding, community investments that produced goodwill instead of immediate profits. More than once she had noticed him leaving board meetings early to visit the library. To Sabine, those were not signs of growth. They were signs of vulnerability. Late one Thursday afternoon, she requested a private meeting with Nerissa inside a law office overlooking Portland Harbor. The invitation sounded professional enough that Nerissa accepted without suspicion. Sabine welcomed her with polished courtesy before placing a cream-colored folder across the conference table. "There are documents you deserve to see," she said calmly. Nerissa opened the folder. The first pages were familiar copies of the marriage agreement. Then came another document she had never seen before, an additional legal amendment dated 2 weeks before the wedding. According to its language, once the board confirmed Lachlan's controlling vote through compliance with the family trust, legal counsel had already prepared preliminary paperwork allowing the marriage to end immediately afterward. Nerissa slowly turned each page, her heartbeat growing quieter instead of louder. Attached behind the amendment rested internal planning notes discussing public relations strategies, asset protection, and timelines following a future divorce. None of the pages carried Lachlan's handwritten approval, yet every document bore the letterhead of his legal team. Sabine folded her hands. "Businessmen prepare for every possible outcome. I thought you deserved to know where you stood from the beginning." Nerissa closed the folder with measured care. "Why show me this now?" Sabine answered without hesitation. "Because emotions have a way of making intelligent women ignore facts." The drive back to Camden passed beneath a gray sky heavy with approaching rain. The folder rested unopened on the passenger seat, yet every sentence inside echoed through her thoughts. She remembered the repaired reading lamp, the preserved lighthouse, the coffee that always arrived exactly as she preferred it. Had those moments been genuine or carefully managed details inside a larger strategy? That evening, Lachlan returned later than usual after an emergency board session. He found Nerissa standing alone beside the western windows, watching waves disappear into darkness beyond the cliffs. Without turning around, she placed the folder on the console table between them. He recognized it immediately. The color drained almost imperceptibly from his face. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "Does it matter?" She replied. "Tell me one thing instead. Was any part of this marriage ever meant to survive beyond the contract?" Lachlan looked at the documents, then back at the woman who had slowly transformed both his house and the silence inside it. The truth was far more complicated than those pages suggested. Federal investigators had quietly begun examining financial manipulation connected to several board members, including Sabine, revealing why those draft documents existed and why they had never been executed could compromise an active investigation months before authorities were ready to act. He opened his mouth, searching for words that could protect both the investigation and the woman standing before him. None came. His silence settled into the room with devastating weight. Nerissa lowered her eyes for only a second before giving the smallest nod, as though his inability to answer had already answered everything she needed to know. Rain arrived before dawn and never seemed to stop. A fine gray curtain drifted across the Atlantic, softening the cliffs beyond the estate until the ocean and sky became one endless horizon. Inside the guest room, Nerissa folded her clothes into a single suitcase with the same careful hands that had once restored fragile pieces of history. She did not rush. She did not cry. Every sweater was folded neatly. Every drawing tube was secured with quiet precision. On the writing desk rested the brass key Lachlan had placed before her on their first evening together. She looked at it for a long moment before setting it beside a sealed envelope. There was no anger in the room. Only the unmistakable stillness that follows a decision finally made. Earlier that morning, she had called the restoration director at the Bellwether Historical Library. She explained that she would be stepping away from the project indefinitely and recommended another preservation architect to oversee the remaining work. The director protested, reminding her that the library existed only because she had refused to let it disappear. Nerissa thanked him gently before ending the call. Some dreams survived broken promises. Others needed distance before they could breathe again. Downstairs, the estate carried on as though nothing had changed. Staff members prepared breakfast. Gardeners worked beneath waterproof jackets. Somewhere beyond the library, Lachlan remained locked inside another emergency board meeting that had stretched far longer than expected. He had left before sunrise without seeing her. Before closing the guest room door for the final time, Nerissa placed one more item beside the envelope. It was the original sketch she had drawn weeks earlier while imagining what the Billionaire estate could become. Sunlight filled every hallway. The old piano room stood open. Fresh flowers rested beside the western windows. At the center of the drawing, two people shared dinner at the same table without the weight of silence between them. She turned the page over and wrote only one sentence beneath the sketch. A house cannot become a home when one person is always expected to remain a guest. She removed her wedding ring with slow, steady fingers and placed it beside the brass key. Then she lifted her suitcase and quietly walked through the front entrance. The Atlantic wind greeted her one last time. She did not look back. The drive south toward Portland carried her along familiar coastal roads lined with bright autumn trees whose leaves surrendered gracefully to the season. By late afternoon, she reached the train station, purchased a one-way ticket to Boston, and settled onto a wooden bench beneath the old departure board. Around her, families embraced, travelers hurried toward platforms, and children laughed beneath umbrellas. Life continued exactly as it always had. Only her future had become unexpectedly empty. Back at the Billionaire estate, darkness had already settled by the time Lachlan returned. The board meeting had ended with another exhausting debate over acquisitions, shareholder pressure, and legal strategy. None of it remained in his thoughts as he crossed the entrance hall. Something felt different. The house was unusually quiet. He climbed the staircase almost automatically before stopping outside the guest room. The door stood slightly open. Inside, the room was perfectly arranged. The bed had been made with military precision. The closet was empty. The reading lamp glowed softly beside a chair no one would use again. On the desk rested the brass key, the wedding ring, the sealed envelope, and the rolled architectural sketch. Lachlan stepped forward slowly, as though afraid that any sudden movement might somehow erase what lay before him. He unfolded the drawing first. His eyes traveled across every careful line until they reached the handwritten sentence beneath it. He read it once, then again. His breathing grew unsteady for the first time in years. This room had always been temporary. He had believed he was protecting himself by asking her to stay there. Only now did he understand what he had truly built. Not distance, not safety. A daily reminder that the woman slowly teaching him how to feel welcome had never once been welcomed herself. Outside, a train whistle echoed faintly across the coastline as another evening settled over Maine. Lachlan closed his hand around the small brass key, but it no longer felt like something that unlocked a door. It felt like the weight of every word he had never found the courage to say before she walked away. The following morning, the Billionaire boardroom overlooked Portland Harbor beneath a sky still heavy with rain, but for the first time in years, Lachlan barely noticed the view. The brass key remained inside his coat pocket, and every time his hand brushed against it, he remembered the empty guest room waiting at home. Around the polished conference table, directors discussed quarterly earnings, acquisition targets, and shareholder confidence with practiced certainty. Sabine Hollister confidently presented the final agenda, believing the day would secure complete control over the company's future. When she finished speaking, Lachlan slowly stood. The room immediately fell silent. He placed a thick folder on the table before looking at every director one by one. "Before we vote," he said calmly, "there is something this board deserves to know." He opened the folder, revealing legal correspondence, financial records, and internal communications that federal investigators had quietly requested for months. He explained that several draft legal documents, including the amendment prepared before his marriage, had remained deliberately untouched because investigators had been tracking an effort to manipulate corporate governance through deceptive legal planning. Those draft papers had never become valid agreements, but someone had intentionally preserved them to create future leverage. Sabine's expression changed for the first time since the meeting began. Lachlan continued with steady conviction. "I remained silent because I believed protecting an investigation would eventually protect this company. Instead, my silence destroyed the trust of the one person who deserved honesty more than anyone else." The room remained completely still. Then he reached for another document. It was his own resignation from the voting protections granted by the Vayner Family Trust. Several directors immediately protested. Others warned that surrendering those rights could weaken his authority as chief executive officer. Lachlan quietly signed the document anyway. "If leadership depends upon hiding the truth from someone I promised to respect, then I have already failed as a leader." No one spoke after that. Even Sabine lowered her eyes as federal representatives entered the boardroom with legal notices requesting additional corporate records. The meeting ended without celebration, without applause, and without victory. As soon as Lachlan stepped outside, he instructed his driver to head toward Portland Union Station. The highway stretched ahead beneath clearing skies, while autumn sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds. He arrived only minutes after the evening train had departed. Standing alone beside the empty platform, he watched the final passenger cars disappear around a distant curve until nothing remained except steel tracks shining beneath the fading light. He reached into his pocket and closed his hand around the small brass key. For months he had believed it represented order, boundaries, and control. Now it reminded him only of a door he had never truly opened. Before leaving the station, he removed his phone and recorded a single voice message. His voice was quiet, almost unrecognizable. "I spent my life protecting everything I built. Then I came home to an empty room and realized the only thing worth protecting had already walked away. I cannot ask you to return. I can only become the man who should have welcomed you from the very beginning." 3 months later, spring returned to the coast of Maine with gentle rain, fresh green leaves, and sunlight that lingered a little longer each evening. The Bellwether Historical Library stood proudly once again, its restored brick walls glowing beneath the morning light while families, students, and local craftsmen gathered outside for its official reopening. The old oak doors, once swollen from years of neglect, now opened effortlessly. Inside, polished wooden shelves stretched toward high ceilings where restored stained glass scattered warm colors across the reading room. Every repaired beam carried the fingerprints of people who believed that preserving the past was another way of believing in the future. Narissa stood near the entrance greeting guests with the quiet confidence that had never depended upon wealth or status. She had declined every interview offered by newspapers and television stations. The library was never meant to become a monument to her. It belonged to the community that had protected it long before she ever arrived. As the ceremony began, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the last row of chairs. Lachlan had come alone. There were no security officers surrounding him, no reporters, no photographers. He wore a simple navy suit instead of the commanding presence that had once followed him into every room. He remained quietly among the guests, applauding when the ribbon was cut, never asking anyone to notice that much of the funding had come from him after he permanently transferred the entire Restoration Trust into an independent community foundation under Narissa's leadership. He had kept every promise without expecting anything in return. When the visitors slowly drifted through the restored galleries, Nerissa walked toward him. For several moments, neither spoke. They simply looked around the library that had survived because both of them had eventually chosen truth over convenience. "You finished what you started," she said softly. Lachlan nodded. "You taught me that some things should never belong to one person." From his coat pocket, he removed a small velvet pouch and placed it gently into her hands. Inside rested a single brass key, polished until it reflected the sunlight pouring through the stained glass above them. "This is not the key to a guest room," he said quietly. "After you left, I transferred ownership of the estate into both our names. Every room is open now. There are no conditions, no deadlines, no contracts waiting at the end." Nerissa closed her fingers around the key without answering immediately. Then she looked into his eyes and saw something she had never seen on the night they married. There was no control left there. Only humility. Only hope. She stepped toward the library's front entrance and placed the key back into his palm before gently folding his fingers around it. "A house was never what I needed," she whispered. "I only wanted to know I was welcome." Lachlan walked to the great oak doors and slowly pulled one open. Instead of reaching for her hand or asking her to follow, he simply stepped aside. Nerissa smiled, crossed the threshold by her own choice, and together they entered the sunlight beyond the doorway, not because a contract had bound their lives together, but because two hearts had finally learned that the strongest home is built where respect opens every door long before love ever asks someone to stay. Sometimes the hardest door to open is the one we closed ourselves. If you were standing where Nerissa stood, and the person who once made you feel like a guest had truly changed through actions instead of promises, would you walk back inside, or would you choose a different path forever? I would really love to hear what your heart would decide in the comments.